We'll move to questions without notice. Are there any questions? And I give the call to the Honourable the Deputy Leader of the Opposition.
My question is to the Minister for Indigenous Australians.
Order. Order. Members on my right order. Members on my left and right will be silent so I can hear the question. I'll ask the Deputy Leader to begin her question again.
My question is to the Minister for Indigenous Australians. Last month, the Minister said, and I quote, "The Makarrata Commission would have two jobs. First, the national process of truth-telling and national agreement-making, which is really code for treaty, without saying it." End quote. Would the Minister explain this statement to the House?
Give a call to the Minister for Indigenous Australians. The member for Deakin will cease interjecting.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Can I thank the member for Farrer for her question and say that my visit to your electorate was incredibly successful. The word Makarrata is a word from the language of the Yolngu people from Arnhem Land. It means coming together after a struggle, facing the facts of wrongs, living together in peace. And that word was gifted to the Uluru Statement from the late Yunupingu, the great Gumatj leader from North East Arnhem Land. This weekend at Gama, we will gather again and we will remember his legacy and all that he did for his people over so many years. And more than anything, he wanted to see constitutional recognition through a voice made a reality. Later this year, we have the chance to do that. Recognition, listening and better results.
Give a call to the member for Canberra.
Thank you, Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Housing. What is the Albanese Labor government's policy to get more vulnerable Australians into housing, and what is blocking further action?
Give the call to the Minister for Housing, Homelessness and Small Business.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. And I want to thank the member for Canberra for her important question and for her interest in our broad housing agenda. Indeed, it's an agenda that we have been working on every day.
The member for Barker will cease interjecting for the remainder of this answer.
It is an agenda that we've added to at every possible opportunity, whether it be for renters, for homeowners, for Australians looking for a safe, affordable place to call home. It's why we recently announced, of course, the $2 billion Social Housing Accelerator to add to our agenda to deliver thousands of more social homes across Australia. Now, we're working hard to deliver on this because we know this action is needed. We're working hard to turn around the challenges that we inherited, as I talked about yesterday. We inherited, after a decade, very little action from those opposite.
Just pause a minute, Minister. I said at the beginning of this answer the member would not interrupt during this answer, and he's done that. So he's now warned. Yes, the member for Deakin. The Minister in continuation.
We're working hard to turn around the challenges we inherited after a decade of very little from those opposite. Indeed, we're working hard to help the people that those opposite failed.
Order.
We all know the Liberals and the Nationals never supported social housing.
Order.
We know that in
Members
government
on my left.
that they were heartless when it came to the robo-debt victims. So I say to those opposite in the Liberals and the National parties, it's time to find a heart and it's time to listen to people who desperately need housing right across Australia. It's not just robo-debt though, Mr Speaker. Those opposite have failed to take responsibility for their inaction in housing too, for the thousands of Australians currently waiting on public housing waiting lists.
Member for Macarthur.
After a decade of allowing the housing challenges across the country to grow, the Liberals and the Nationals are now blocking homes for people that need them. Those opposite, together with the Greens, who they've teamed up with, are blocking tens of thousands of social and affordable homes that would be built under the $10 billion Housing Australia Future Fund. They're blocking homes for women and children fleeing family violence. They're blocking homes for older women at risk of homelessness. They're blocking homes for veterans at risk of homelessness. And that's why we're giving them another chance. That's why we're reintroducing that bill today, Mr Speaker, because I say to them, please do not continue to block homes. Don't continue to block homes for people like Laurie that I spoke about on Monday in this place, who wants to go back to school. Don't block homes for people like Lisa and Sean. Sean, who can now have an operation because he has somewhere to go home to. That is the seriousness of what we are talking about here. We want this bill to pass. That's why we've reintroduced it. We want to build more homes. It's as simple as that. And we want those opposite and the Greens to join us and the crossbench to pass this bill. We want you to join the community housing providers who want this bill passed. We want you to join the state and territory housing ministers who want this bill passed. We want you to join the experts and those on the front line of our housing challenges that want this bill passed. You know, we heard from the NBA today that we cannot afford to play politics with the lives of many Australians who are struggling, Mr Speaker. Time to get on with it.
Give a call to the honourable member for Capricornia.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Indigenous Australians. On the 15th of November 2021, the now Prime Minister said, quote, "The Makarrata Commission will be independent and have responsibility for truth-telling and treaty making. It will work with a voice to Parliament when it is established. When will Australians know the details about the government's Makarrata Commission?" Thank you.
Give the call to the Minister for Indigenous Australians.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. And can I thank the member for Capricornia for her question. The government of this country supports the Uluru Statement from the heart. And the Uluru Statement has three elements. The first request is for a voice to Parliament, which is what the referendum will be about this year. It then refers to a Makarrata for truth-telling and agreement-making. Progress on Makarrata will not occur until after the referendum. Our priority is constitutional recognition through a voice. Our priority is recognition, listening and getting better results. The 2023 referendum is an opportunity to advance reconciliation and move Australia forward for everyone.
Give the call to the member for Dunkley.
Thank you, Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Social Services. What action is the Albanese Labor government taking to provide support for some of Australia's most vulnerable people, rather than punishing them?
Give the call to the Minister for Social Services.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I'd like to thank the member for Dunkley for that question and for her passion that she shows for those most vulnerable in her community and indeed right round Australia. I'm very pleased to announce to the House that the Albanese government strengthening the safety net package has just passed the Parliament. Now, this package includes a range of important and targeted measures to boost support to those most vulnerable. Now, from the 20th of September, more support is on its way for those who need it most. Now, our safety net bill will deliver more support for those relying on student and working age payments, more support for single parents, more support for older Australians facing additional barriers to work, and more support for those that rely on Commonwealth rent assistance. Now, these measures complement other investments in cost of living support, including investments in Medicare, cheaper childcare, cheaper medicines and energy bill relief. Now, unfortunately, not all members of this Parliament wanted to provide this extra support. Those opposite moved a mean-spirited amendment to scrap the government's $40 boost to working age and student payments, denying much-needed support to almost 1 million Australians. But of course, this is all part of the pattern of those opposite, showing contempt for those that rely on the social security system. The Liberal Party's robo-debt policy demonstrated that contempt as well. Now, through the Royal Commission into robo-debt, it was established that the Liberal National Party's robo-debt policy was a cruel and crude mechanism that was neither fair nor legal and made people feel like criminals. Now, of course, most people would think that was never the intention of robo-debt, but of course it was always those opposites' intention. None of us can forget when the former Minister Tudge said, We will find you. We will track you down. You will have to repay those debts and you may end up in prison. This demonstrates the cruel and callous approach to those opposite. Now, of course, the architect of Robodebt, the member for Cook, regularly bragged about being a strong welfare cop. And he, as the opposition, seems to fail to truly recognise the damage that this scheme has caused. I would encourage those opposite to remind themselves of the Royal Commission's report that heard the evidence from witnesses who spoke about the distress and damage. The Liberal and National Party have demonstrated time and time again they, whether it's in government or opposition, take a cruel and callous approach to those who rely on our social safety net, denying them support they need.
Before I call the member for Fowler, I'm pleased to inform the House the present in the gallery today, as we've heard, is the Honourable Michael Gunner, former Chief Minister of the Northern Territory. Very warm welcome to you. Give the call to the Honourable Member for Fowler.
Thank you, Speaker. My question is to the Treasurer. The Stronger Communities program is small but significant grant for all electorates. We all know how such funds can help our local community organisations with their small projects, such as having their community hall repaired for people to use. In these difficult economic times and low socioeconomic electorates like Fowler, this type of resources is vital. Will the government commit to ensure that this grant will continue in future budget planning?
Order. Give the call to the Treasurer.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I acknowledge Michael Gunner as well, and I thank the member for Fowler for her question about the Stronger Communities grants. As the honourable member would be aware, and probably all members are aware, round 8 of the Stronger Communities program is rolling out right now in our communities. Members of Parliament would be hearing back, and community groups would be hearing back around now about the success or otherwise of the proposals that they have put forward. Round 8 was announced in the March budget of 2022, the last budget under those opposite, but the budget didn't pass the Parliament. And so what we did, and I pay tribute to my ministerial colleague, we budgeted for round 8 in the October budget last year, and that's why it's rolling out right now. The matter of future rounds of Stronger Communities will be the subject, no doubt, of future budget deliberations. But there was no allocation. There was no allocation for Stronger Communities beyond round 8. We'll obviously, in the usual responsible and methodical way, we'll go through the merits of this and we'll make a decision.
On my left.
We'll go through a decision in due course. And, Mr Speaker, I hear those opposite interjecting. Mr Speaker. If they wanted it to go beyond round 8, why didn't they budget for it? Why didn't they budget for it? And there's a pattern of behaviour here, Mr Speaker. They made big announcements about how they were going to chip in 50% of Brisbane Olympic funding, and they provisioned exactly $0 for it. There's a pattern of behaviour. They were really good at the press release. There weren't much chop at the provisioning in the budget for the things that they announced, and that's the case for Stronger Communities as well. But I know that the honourable member for Fowler has asked this question in good faith, and I know that she has also asked about cost of living pressures on her community in Fowler, that really important community in New South Wales. And I wanted to tell the House as well that in addition to deliberating on future rounds of the Stronger Communities grants, when it comes to the cost of living assistance we're providing in Fowler, 39,150 people in Fowler will benefit from cheaper medicines. 95,485 people are eligible for the bulk billing assistance. 14,840 people in Fowler will get the increase, the job seeker Austudy or the youth allowance. 725 people aged 55 to 59 in Fowler will get the extra job seeker. Around 620 parents in Fowler will benefit from the changes to the single parent payment, and around 12,770 households will get the biggest increase to Commonwealth rent assistance in 30 years.
Order. The House comes to order. I'll hear from the member for Jagga Jagga.
Thank you, Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. How will the Housing Australia Future Fund improve the lives of Australians, and what is standing in the way of the government building more homes? How does this legislation fit with the government's commitment to not leave people behind?
Give the call to the Prime Minister.
I thank the member for Jagga for her question. Well, what we know is that those opposite want problems to get worse for Australians because they think that's how things get better for them.
Member for
their priority is all about the politics, about the
members
politics
on my left,
and not about the substance. And we know that the Housing Australia Future Fund was the centrepiece of my second budget reply.
Order.
The Australian people voted for it. It's supported by the housing and homelessness groups across the board, whether it be the Master Builders Association or whether it be organisations like Shelter. It will work alongside our other policies, including the $2 billion Social Housing Accelerator, to build more homes in every state and territory. But those opposite have blocked this bill. It's exactly why
the member for Deakin is now
we
warned.
reintroduced the bill today. But it is what we've come to expect from the party of Robodebt. The same ideology that produced Robodebt still drives the Liberal Party. Their gut instinct is always vindictive, always seeking to punish those who are less well off. Blocking affordable housing for women and children escaping domestic violence is just extraordinary. Now, on Monday, they put out in their vehicle that's open to them on a daily basis the position that they wanted to block increased help for single parents, for people on rental assistance, for job seeker recipients, the extra job seeker for those over 55. They put out there that they were going to block that, but of course that courage didn't last until lunchtime, and the Leader of the Opposition had to reverse the position that he'd put out in the morning on the front page of The Australian. It didn't last 4 hours, but what is constant is their ideological obsession with punishing the most vulnerable. And of course we saw that. We saw that with Robodebt. It's horrifying enough to think that the one lesson that they took from Robodebt was that they didn't go hard enough. It is a pathology of cruelty from those opposite who are determined to make things as bad as possible by standing in the way of legislation that will make a difference because they think that that will give them a political advantage. Well, I say to them that we need to deal with the issue of housing supply. We need to build more houses. There is legislation that is before the parliament that will enable just that to happen, and it should be passed by the Senate.
Give a call to the Honourable the Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question's to the Prime Minister. On 97 occasions, the Prime Minister gave false hope to struggling Australian families and small businesses by promising before the election he would cut power bills by $275 annually, and now he pretends that he never said it. On 34 occasions, the Prime Minister told Australians he was committed to implementing the Uluru Statement in full, which includes a treaty. In a Trainwreck Radio National interview this morning, the Prime Minister was asked 7 times whether he supported a treaty and 7 times refused to give a direct answer. When will we hear a straight word from this Prime Minister?
Order. Order. The Treasurer will cease interjecting. Members on my right, the Treasurer. Order on my left and right. I'll hear from the Leader of the House.
To what?
Point of order, Mr Speaker. Questions are required to include a question, and that one within the 30-second stint.
Small technical matter. I'll deal with this. Yeah. Order. The problem I have with this is there's far too much noise in this chamber. It's accelerated at a rapid rate this week. I'm going to allow the question. If anyone goes over the time limit anymore, they'll be sat down. But I want to reiterate to the House, there must be silence while people are asking questions. I'll call the Prime Minister.
Thanks very much, Mr Speaker. Well, I did note the Leader of the Opposition's reference in an article today by that investigative journalist, James Morrow, who had gone back to 1986, Mr Speaker. Gone back to 1986. He'd gone back to 1986 at a time where Crocodile Dundee had just hit the theatres. Most women didn't have paid maternity leave. It was a crime in some states to be gay or lesbian, and people were being jailed. But there was something else, Mr Speaker. Terra nullius was still the law of the land. It was still the position that it was not acknowledged that there was prior ownership of the land prior to English people coming in 1788. Terra nullius. In 1986, there was no Mabo decision, no native title, no WIC. Those opposite need to say whether that is still their position. Whether that is still their position. Because they're out there.
Order. The member for Groom, the Leader of the Nationals.
Being critical about these issues. Now,
Order.
I am proud, Mr Speaker, to have supported Aboriginal land rights in 1986 and been an advocate for social justice for First Nations people for 4 decades. For 4 decades. And I say to the Leader of the Opposition...
Order. Order. There is far too much noise on my left. The member for Hume is warned. I just said about questions being heard in silence. It goes the same way for answers. Prime Minister in continuation.
I say to the Leader of the Opposition, he needs to spend less time on his dirt unit and more time in the red dirt of the top end. And I invite him to visit Garma on the weekend. I invite him to sit down with Indigenous Australians and talk with them. Not to them, not at them, but talk with them about why it is that they support and came up with the process of the Uluru Statement from the Heart, led of course by the great Yunupingu, who will be missing from this Garma Festival. This is a major Indigenous cultural event in remote Australia. It will be on this weekend. I encourage the Leader of the Opposition to travel with me to that, to sit down and engage constructively, instead of this absolute nonsense.
Order. Give a call to the member for Aston.
Thank you, Speaker. My question is to the Treasurer. How is the Albanese Labor government managing the economy in the interests of all Australians, and what approaches has the government rejected?
Give the call to the Treasurer.
Thanks, Mr Speaker, and thank you to the member for Aston, an absolute champion for her local community in Melbourne. Mr Speaker, as honourable members know, there's no shortage of challenges in the global economy or indeed in our own domestic economy. And while yesterday's decision by the Independent Reserve Bank was welcome relief and a welcome reprieve, we understand that people are still under pressure. And as the RBA made clear yesterday, the Australian economy has already slowed considerably, and this will continue for a little while yet. A combination of high interest rates, high inflation and global uncertainty is slowing our economy. It's putting a strain on our people, and it will have an impact on our labour market as well. And because inflation is still the primary challenge in our economy, it's the major focus of our government, and our relief is targeted to those areas where the pressures are most acute, like out-of-pocket health costs and rent and electricity bills. Mr Speaker, all of this is part of making sure that our economy and our society is more resilient to the global economic uncertainty that lies ahead, and we have made some progress in the last 13, 14 or 15 months of this government in office. It's important to remember, Mr Speaker, that quarterly inflation is now less than half what it was in the last quarter of those opposite. The unemployment rate is lower now than it was when we came to office. The participation rate is higher than when we came to office. Wages growth is quicker than when we came to office after a decade of wage stagnation under those opposite. The deficit was forecast to be $78 billion, and there were big deficits in their budgets every year after that. They delivered the most consecutive deficits of any government since the 1920s. They didn't have enough to show for $1 trillion in debt, and they found no savings at all in their last budget. And compare that to where we are now, Mr Speaker. Inflation is moderating, higher than we'd like, but it is moderating. Unemployment rate is lower, and it's near a 50-year low. There are nearly 500,000 more Australians in work. That's the most jobs created by a new government in a first year on record. A record number of people are in work. Wages are moving again. We've got the first surplus in 15 years, which will be just north of $20 billion. We've got lower deficits over the forward estimates, more than $140 billion lower than what they had in their last budget. The peak in gross debt is lower. The interest costs on debt is $44 billion lower than in their last budget. And we've found $40 billion in savings across our two budgets. Now, Mr Speaker, we know that people are under pressure. We know that there are difficult times ahead, but our responsible economic management and our economic plan is helping people through difficult times. It is laying the foundations for a better future, and it is cleaning up the mess left behind by those opposite.
Give the call to the Deputy Leader of the Opposition.
My question is to the Minister for Indigenous Australians, and I refer to her previous answer, where the Minister said progress of Makarrata will not occur until after the referendum. But, Minister, the government has already spent $900,000 of $5.8 million on this commission. What was this money spent on?
The member for Moreton will leave the chamber under 94A. Can't be clearer when I say I want silence for questions and answers. Give the call to the Minister for Indigenous Australians.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and can I thank the member opposite for her question. I'd like to quote from the Uluru Statement and what it says about Makarrata. It says, "Makarrata is the culmination of our agenda, the coming together after a struggle. It captures our aspirations for a fair and truthful relationship with the people of Australia and a better future for our children based on justice and self-determination."
The Minister has concluded her answer. I give the call to the member for Blair.
Thank you.
The Deputy Leader of the Opposition seeking a point of order. Point of order.
Mr Speaker, is it your ruling that questions can be asked to the Minister and completely unrelated statements can be made, and that she's not being brought back to the question, which was specifically with respect about the timing?
That's not a point of order, so resume your seat. You're asking me a question. We're going to move to the next question because that was not a point of order. I give the call to the member for Blair.
Thank you, Speaker. My question is to the Treasurer. Why is an Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander voice not only important for Australian society, but also for the Australian economy?
Give the call to the Treasurer.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and thank you to the member for Blair for his question. I will stand next to him and campaign with him for a voice to Parliament in South East Queensland and in the nation beyond. Now, Mr Speaker, the reason those opposite ask questions about what the voice isn't about is because they want to distract from what the voice is about. And as the Prime Minister and the Minister have said, the voice to Parliament is about recognition and it's about listening. It's about giving First Nations people a say in the matters which impact them. And it's about making a tangible difference to the lives of people and communities. And that means it's about getting maximum impact for the billions of dollars that we invest each year in closing the gap. And Mr Speaker, we shouldn't pretend that we have to choose here between good social outcomes and good economic outcomes, or that they are competing priorities. They're not. The voice is about better outcomes. It's about better value for money, and that makes it good economic policy as well. Now, Mr Speaker, we won't get better outcomes in this country by listening less. We won't get better outcomes by leaving this to our kids to sort out down the track some kind of generational buck pass, Mr Speaker, or by surrendering to the scares and the lies and the cynicism and the misinformation which is egged on by too many of those opposite Mr Speaker. We'll get better outcomes if we listen more and if we build on a foundation of recognition and respect and decency and optimism. I think a lot about what Minister Burney has said, and she said this: for too long, governments have made policies for Indigenous Australians, not with Indigenous Australians. The minister is spot on. This is a chance to do things differently and to do them better. We won't get better outcomes by doing everything the same way that has delivered us a wasted decade of division, of disadvantage and disappointment. We want more people in work, in training, in uni, in good health, in good schools and safe communities and out of the justice system. Just last week, the Productivity Commission laid out the challenges before us and said that we need more consultation. We need to involve and empower people if we want to make a real impact. So this is about value for money, but it's about much more than that as well. This is our big chance and we can't waste it. This is our generational opportunity to do the right thing and to grasp the hand which has been stretched generously out to us, to move forward together in a spirit of respect and unity and decency and optimism in a commonwealth of common purpose, shaping a better future on our terms, making a tangible, enduring difference to First Nations people and communities around our country and strengthening our economy and our society in the process.
Give the call to the member for Flynn.
Mr Speaker, my question is to the Minister for Environment and Water. So far, the Minister has failed to rule out requiring farmers and landholders to undertake cultural surveys for agricultural practices on their private property as part of federal cultural heritage reforms. Why won't the Minister rule it out?
The call to the Minister for the Environment and Water.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I am so delighted to get this question. In fact, I was getting a little bit worried that we weren't going to go back here today, so thank you.
Order.
Mr Speaker, I have made super clear, each day I've been asked this, we are not about to adopt WA laws or the laws of any state or territory. We are about reforming our cultural heritage laws as a Commonwealth government in the same way, that those opposite were previously in favour of doing this important work. And I have to say, credit where credit is due. The former Minister for the Environment began this work. She did begin this work, and she made some very important statements about this. She said in 2021, more than 2 years ago, and I quote, "In the wake of the destruction of Indigenous sites at Juukan, we have commenced work with state governments and territories and traditional owners to highlight the need for the modernisation of Indigenous heritage protection laws." She also said, and I quote, "I am working with the First Nations Heritage Protection Alliance to discuss a pathway forward to better protect Indigenous cultural heritage." She also said in a media release, Juukan Gorge, and that it highlighted a wider need for the modernisation of Indigenous heritage protection laws in Australia. This year's budget included funding for an engagement process that will work closely with traditional owners. Oh my goodness.
All right, we'll just get the Minister to pause, and I'll hear from the Leader of the Nationals on point of order.
relevance, Mr Speaker, and to help the Minister, this is about farmers, not miners.
The Minister is being relevant. The question was about cultural surveys. Order. The Minister has the call.
The former minister also said those heritage protection processes are not owned by the Commonwealth, they're owned by state governments. Again, we agree. So what we have to do now, and what I've already started doing, is working out how the states and Commonwealth can come together so we don't have gaps in cultural heritage protection. Now, so many great quotes from the former minister, but I want to share this around a bit, because the member for Leichhardt has done excellent work with Senator Dodson on leading those two Duke and Gorge inquiries. The member for Leichhardt has talked about the serious deficiencies in the laws. The legislative frameworks in Australia, in all Australian jurisdictions, he said, need to be modernised. Action must be a national priority. The Shadow Environment Minister, much more recently, has told the other place just last year those events Duke and Gorge were so disastrous they made it very clear that comprehensive work needed to begin as a matter of urgency on modernising Indigenous heritage protection laws. The member for Cowper, thank you, member for Cowper, for his bipartisan support for this work. We are very pleased that the minister has now made clear that she, that's me, will be continuing the work that has already begun. This vital process he talks about.
The minister's time has concluded. Order. When the House comes to order. The Deputy Leader of the Opposition. I'll hear from the member for Cunningham.
My question is to the Minister for Government Services. In light of the final report of the Royal Commission into Robodebt, what are the lessons? Why should Australians have confidence in the conduct of the Royal Commission?
Give the call to the Minister for the National Disability Insurance Scheme and the Minister for Government Services.
One lesson from the Royal Commission is that when governments are warned about harmful policies, don't shoot the messenger. But in his statement to the House on Monday, the member for Cook repeatedly attacked the Royal Commission's credibility. Doing what he does best, having gaslit the nation for 4 years, he's now gaslighting the Royal Commission. In exonerating himself on Monday, the member for Cook used coded and loaded words to discredit the Royal Commission. Let me repeat some of the coded and loaded language of the member for Cook. He dismissed the findings as disproportionate, wrong, unsubstantiated, contradicted by clear evidence. He accused the finding as not credible or reasonable, unfair, retroactive. He painted the findings as allegations, unreasonable, untenable, false and speculative. He fumed that the Royal Commission was speculative and wrong. He verbally punched, wrong, unsubstantiated, absurd.
He
delegitimised the Royal Commission as quasi-legal, as if somehow there was a question mark on the fairness of the Royal Commission. Interestingly, the Leader of the Opposition commended the member for Cook's speech.
Members on my left.
Now, while the Royal Commissioner can't speak for herself, the Royal Commission anticipated such fake news attacks. Volume 1, pages 6 to 7 of the report directly addressed questions of procedural fairness and the standard of proof.
The Leader of the Opposition will cease.
The Commission noted it applied the rules of procedural fairness. Persons likely to have findings made against them were notified in advance, given the chance to respond before the final report. All witnesses had the chance to seek leave to cross-examine other witnesses. The Commission's processes were inquisitorial, not adversarial, not a party advancing a particular case. The Commission explained that where she made findings against individuals that were liable to cause real damage to reputation, she adhered to the Brigginshaw standard. That is the application of extra care when making findings of fact in serious civil matters. The Commissioner specifically stated she did not reach her conclusions without a high degree of satisfaction as to the evidence. But the challenge now for the opposition and the Leader of the Opposition is as simple as this, courtesy of the member for Cook. He disputes it. He implies very clearly that he didn't get a fair go. So the choice for the Leader of the Opposition is very straightforward. Who's correct? Is it the member for Cook, who you said gave strong defence on Monday night? But they were clever weasel words from the Leader of the Opposition. He said strong defence. He didn't actually say if he agreed with them. So now what we've got to do is ask the question of the Leader of the Opposition. This is a test for your leadership. Do you back for the member for Cook, or do you back the Royal Commission? You're in an untenable position and you can't sit on the fence any longer. My advice is Cut him loose before he drags you down with him.
I give the call to the member for Brisbane. The member for Brisbane. Close. Give the call to the member for Brisbane.
Easily confused, Mr. Speaker. They lost my seat, so you know.
My question is to the Prime Minister. Will get on with his question.
My question is to the Prime Minister. This morning on ABC Radio, you left the door open to how to get your gas tax changes through the Senate. It seems the government now has two choices. Finally stand up to the fossil fuel industry and work with the Greens and the crossbench to dramatically increase tax revenue from gas companies, or to make a deal with the Liberals to weaken environmental approvals for gas projects in exchange for their support. Which option will you take?
I give the call to the Prime Minister.
I thank the member for Brisbane for his question, and I say to him, I know this will come as no surprise to him. I would have thought the government's position is in what we've put forward to the Senate. That's the government's position. Now, the Greens have a position of do they want to oppose that and therefore have less revenue earlier from the gas industry. That's a question that they have to answer. The Liberal Party, of course, have a question before them as well. Do they support a fairer outcome, which is there in the legislation that has been put forward, that's been considered by the government on the basis of proper advice, proper consultation as well? It's strange to get a question about what should the other parties other than Labor do, which is essentially what the question comes to. But what we are doing is fair, is right. We'll produce extra revenue for the government earlier, which is why we came up with that position. And I'd urge the Greens have the opportunity to talk to your Senate colleagues. Don't do what you've done up to now with the Housing Australia Future Fund and say we want more, therefore we'll have nothing. Therefore we'll have nothing. Don't do the same thing and say we want more revenue, therefore we won't have any revenue from the gas sector. That's up to you to determine your own position, but our position's very clear in what we've put forward. We'll continue to support that, and it's up to those opposite whether we see the no-alition continuing between the coalition, the Greens political party, and of course One Nation, the same no-alition that have combined in the Senate to up to this point oppose the Housing Australia Future Fund. I urge you to not do that. I urge you to stand up for more revenue so that therefore there can be better spending earlier on what Australia needs as health and education and housing and other issues.
Call to the honourable member for Parramatta.
Thank you, Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Health. How will 60-day prescribing make medicines cheaper for Australians with ongoing health conditions? Why wasn't this policy previously introduced?
Give the call to the Minister for Health and Aged Care.
Well, thank you, Speaker. I thank the member for Parramatta for his question. An enormously talented new member of Parliament. We're very, very lucky indeed to have him as part of the Labor team. And I say he, along with all other members of the Labor team, the last election promised Australians cheaper medicines. And already in just 12 months, Mr Speaker, we have delivered 3 stages of cheaper medicines reform, including obviously the largest cut to the price of medicines in the 75-year history of the PBS on the 1st of January, a cut that has already delivered $120 million back into the pockets of hard-working Australians. But, Mr Speaker, we know there is more to do, which is why we've accepted the advice of the medicines experts who manage the PBS to allow doctors to issue 60-day prescriptions for ongoing health conditions at the same price as a 30-day script, halving the cost of some medicines for 6 million Australian patients and freeing up millions of GP consults. Now, Mr Speaker, 30-day scripts make a lot of sense for a one-off course medicine for a single episode of illness, but they make no sense whatsoever for ongoing chronic health conditions where patients are on the same medicine year in, year out, decade in, decade out, sometimes for the remainder of their life. And that is why countries that we would usually compare ourselves to, like the UK, Canada, New Zealand and so many more, have been allowing 60 or even 90-day prescriptions for a long period of time. And that's why, Mr Speaker, our policy is supported by pretty much every single patient group, every doctor group in the country. But, Mr Speaker, as the question says, this is not new advice. It was provided by the same experts to the former government 5 long years ago, and they shelved it. They backed the lobby group instead of millions of hard-working Australian patients, making those patients shell out hundreds of millions of dollars that they shouldn't have had to pay. And, Mr Speaker, it seems they haven't learned, because this week I read in the News Limited tabloids half-price medicines in jeopardy as Coalition refuses support, blocking yet another sensible cost-of-living measure that will help 6 million Australian patients with their hip pocket pressure and their health. Well, Mr Speaker, this might not come as a surprise, given the Leader of the Opposition's record as a health minister. Not only did he try to abolish bulk billing, he also tried to jack up the price of scripts by $5. So maybe it's not a surprise to those hard-working patients he never supported as health minister. Mr Speaker, though, it does show they've learned absolutely nothing from 9 years of cuts and neglect to Medicare.
I give the call to the member for Banks.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Communications. I refer to the pre-dawn home invasion by protesters at the home of Woodside's Chief Executive Officer and her family. It was filmed by an ABC crew who were also present. Minister, who at the ABC had knowledge of the protesters' plans to carry out this home invasion? Has the minister asked the ABC if the person who took the decision to send along a camera crew in these circumstances will be sacked?
Give the call to the Minister for Communications.
Unlike the AWU.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for his question. I start by reiterating the comments of my colleague, the Minister for Resources, who has very eloquently and accurately stated that the unacceptable behaviour towards a private citizen in this matter is completely unacceptable. I also note, Mr Speaker, that the ABC, whilst it has operational independence as well as editorial independence, that management will offer detailed commentary on this matter. I understand the ABC has confirmed that a television crew was present to film the protest for an upcoming report. According to the statements by the ABC, they have said they had no knowledge of the nature of the behaviour that would occur.
Order.
I also reiterate, Mr Speaker, that I have sought further information from the ABC on this matter in addition to their public statements. However, again, I note that the ABC has both operational and editorial independence, and I await that further advice that I have requested.
Oh. There is far too much noise in the chamber. I'll give the call to the honourable member for Swan.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Skills and Training. How is the Albanese Labor government's fee-free TAFE policy helping to support Australians with cost of living relief, and what has the response been?
Call to the Minister for Skills and Training.
Well, thank you, Speaker. I'd like to thank the member for Swan for her question, and I do look forward to joining her, the member, at Bentley TAFE in her electorate later this month. Speaker, the Albanese government, of course, has been very focused on introducing and initiating and implementing fee-free TAFE, and it's been an extraordinary success. Over 150,000 Australians have enrolled in these fee-free TAFE courses, increasing access to training and skills that are in demand in our economy. And we've entered, of course, negotiations with states and territories to extend this approach into 2024 and beyond, because we know that 9 out of every 10 future jobs rely upon post-secondary school qualifications, whether that's in higher education, universities or the vet sector. We understand that, and the vet sector is indeed doing much of the heavy lifting. That's why we're investing in TAFEs and students to ensure a pipeline of skills that are critical for this nation's future. It's critical in the areas of energy, sovereign capability, the care economy and many other sectors as well. And the most popular courses to date have been precisely in these skill priority areas, whether that be early childhood education, nursing, cybersecurity, manufacturing, the energy sector and indeed construction. So we are continuing to work in these areas of demand. But fundamental to fee-free TAFE is the opportunity it provides Australians to get good, secure jobs in areas of high demand, and also to supply those skills that businesses are crying out for. Our policy, of course, is also providing cost of living relief and removing cost barriers so that students and workers can access those much-needed skills. But, Speaker, not everybody agrees with our plans to support students. According to the Deputy Leader of the Opposition, fee-free TAFE is, and I quote, wasteful spending. So, Speaker, an initiative that is providing much-needed skills to students, to workers, to businesses and to our economy, according to those opposite, is wasteful spending. Well, what would you expect of the Liberal Party? The party of robo-debt. Speaker, a party that knowingly continued an illegal scheme that persecuted hundreds of thousands of vulnerable Australians.
The Minister will pause. I'll hear from the Manager of Opposition Business.
Well,
the Minister will pause and resume his seat.
Mr Speaker, on relevance, the question was fee-free TAFE. What has the response been? We've now got the Minister going off on a frolic on a completely unrelated matter. You should direct him back to the question.
The Leader of the House.
Mr Speaker, to the point of order, the Minister is explaining what the response has been. And there is nothing out of order with the Minister explaining that the response has been consistent with how they responded with robo-debt. It's a completely reasonable part of the response.
The question was about dealing with the cost of living relief. I'm just going to ask the Minister to ensure his answer is reflective of that part of the question. He is entitled to a remaining 24 seconds.
I understand the Manager of Opposition Business has been touchy on this issue because they haven't apologised, they don't show any contrition with respect to this scheme. Speaker, they show a callous disregard, whether it's students who need access to skills or whether it was in fact vulnerable Australians that were subjected to the persecution we saw under the robo-debt scheme.
Or the Deputy Leader of the Opposition will cease interjecting constantly. Give the call to the member for North Sydney.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. In this year's, my question is to the Treasurer. In this year's budget, individual taxpayers accounted for 48% of total revenue, whilst 30% of large corporations operating in Australia paid no tax at all here. It's estimated that 1 in every 4 tax dollars lost to multinational tax avoidance can be prevented by requiring all companies to publish country-by-country data. When will the government shift the burden away from individual taxpayers and place a fairer share on multinationals by introducing public country-by-country reporting?
The call to the Treasurer.
Yeah, thanks, Mr Speaker. I appreciate the question from the member for North Sydney about multinational tax reform. The member for North Sydney knows that this is a big priority of this government. And if you look at the October budget last year, the May budget this year, one of the handful of tax changes in those budgets were around multinationals. As has been publicly reported and accurately reported, we are proceeding with a number of the elements of our multinational tax plan. We need a bit more time on country-by-country reporting. And that's the truth of it. We are genuine about our consultation, as you'd expect. We want to get it absolutely right. There are some elements of the plan which are ready to go, which we've budgeted for, which we are advancing in this place in different ways. But we've said that we need a bit more time on country-by-country reporting, and I'd be very happy to arrange a briefing if the member for North Sydney would like it from either myself and my colleagues or the Treasury colleagues, because I do understand that your interest in it is genuine, and we're happy to keep you posted as we progress through the additional consultation that myself and the Assistant Minister will undertake.
Call to the member for Fraser.
Thank you. My question is to the Minister for Aged Care. After a decade of missed opportunity, what is the Albanese Labor government doing to deliver the care that older Australians deserve and support the skilled and dedicated aged care workers who care for them?
Call to the Minister for Aged Care and Sport.
I thank the member for Fraser for his question, and I know he has been very engaged with our reform process and ensuring that the aged care workers in his electorate are set up for their future. And this answer begins with thanking those amazing aged care workers for everything that they have done and everything that they continue to do for older Australians. This government and the members on this side of the chamber deeply value you and your work. But thanks is not enough. Working in aged care is difficult, it is complex, and it is emotionally demanding work. And it is skilled work. And the aged care workforce deserves to be recognised for that through their pay. And on the 1st of July, that is exactly what happened when 250,000 dedicated aged care workers received a much-needed and much-deserved 15% increase above the award as a pay rise. This is in recognition of their incredible work. But it's also important cost of living relief, helping to ease the pressure on families and family budgets. This pay rise means a $3.40 per hour increase for the lowest paid direct care workers, and for those personal care workers with years and decades of experience, it finally pushes them above the $30 per hour threshold for the very first time. For a registered nurse, it means up to an additional $10,000 per year in their pay, which is a life-changing pay rise for aged care workers and for their families. For Helen, who's an AIN, a nursing assistant for more than 18 years, she tells us this pay rise has meant that she can finally afford the hearing aid that she needs. Oh, wow. And this pay rise will also help change the lives of those that they care for. It will help us recruit the workforce, it will help us retain the workforce that we need to provide the high quality care that all older Australians deserve. I think I can speak for every MP on this side of the chamber when I say that we couldn't be more proud to have been the government to deliver this increase for the aged care workforce, $11.3 billion, which is over 10 times what the previous coalition government spent on their workforce pillar. Yeah. Those opposite ignored aged care workers through their wasted decade in government, and the workforce will not forget their shocking neglect in a hurry. That's right. This government is not afraid to stand up for our aged care workers. We are delivering for them, we are delivering for the older Australians that they care for, and we are laying the foundations for a better future for aged care in this country.
Hear, hear. Give the call to the member for Hume.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. The Courier Mail today reveals that more than 43% of Queensland households are facing mortgage stress. But the Treasurer says that housing serviceability for mortgage holders has improved. Does the Prime Minister believe it is now easier for Australian households to service their mortgages?
I give the call to the Prime Minister.
Speaker, I thank the Shadow Treasurer for his question, and I say that there's more than one group of people who need to listen, because he obviously hasn't listened to what the Treasurer has made very clear, which is he's made very
Hume
clear
has asked his question.
That we understand that there are pressures on cost of living, and that is why the measures that we have put in place have been aimed at alleviating the pressure on cost of living without putting further pressure on inflation. That's why we designed the Energy Price Relief Plan in the way that we did, which will take 0.75% off the inflation rate according to Treasury and the Reserve Bank. That's why we prioritised cheaper childcare, which will boost workforce participation of women and boost productivity. That's why we're addressing supply chain issues through fee-free TAFE. 180,000 delivered, 300,000 to come opposed by those opposite and seen as wasteful spending. We regard this as an investment that will boost productivity, that will boost the economy whilst not putting pressure on inflation. It's why we have a policy to assist households with cheaper medicines, already delivering substantial amounts through our measures on January 1, but more to come. It's why we have our three-point plan to deal with inflationary pressures, including dealing with supply chain issues through our creation of the National Reconstruction Fund, opposed by those opposite. It's why we're dealing with skills shortages through the creation of Jobs and Skills Australia, opposed by those opposite, like they oppose fee-free TAFE. This government is determined to make a difference to people, and it contrasts with those opposite who sat by and watched Robodebt and the evidence that came amongst some of the most vulnerable. Melanie, who appeared at the Commission, said this: "I had to sell everything I could sell just to get a little bit by. I had to go to the Salvation Army for the first time ever in my life, and it was quite degrading. It made me feel like I was a criminal."
The Prime Minister will pause. The Minister for Climate Change and Energy is not helping. I'll hear from the member for Hume on a point of order.
Mr Speaker, relevance. These comments have absolutely nothing to do with mortgage serviceability,
Resume your seat. The question was about Queenslanders experiencing mortgage stress. The Prime Minister is being relevant. I'm going to listen for the remainder 30 seconds. We're talking about people under mortgage stress and the impacts. I'm listening to what he says for the remainder 30 seconds to make sure he is relevant.
There was evidence also given from Anne Julie, who was in a position of living in a refuge. What she had to say was this: "When I got my Robodebt, I was pregnant and living in a refuge in Canberra after escaping domestic violence. I was working 3 jobs to stay afloat. Because of this debt, I was unable to afford medication and was hospitalised." That's the position that those opposite sat by year after year, even after they were warned. No compassion, no care.
Concluded. Give the call to the member for Spence.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Industry and Science. What is the Albanese Labor government doing to help reduce pressure on energy prices for Australian manufacturers, like those in my electorate? How has this been effective compared to other approaches?
The call to the Minister for Industry and Science.
Thanks, Speaker, and it's terrific to get a great question from a huge supporter of Australian manufacturing, and thank you for that. The Albanese government believes in a future made in Australia. It's important for our longer-term economic and social good, and revitalising Australian manufacturing is a big part of that.
Member for Fairfax.
But if we want that to happen,
the Minister will pause. The member for Fairfax. I want to be clear. I can definitely hear what you're saying. I'm just going to ask you to cease interjecting. The Minister in continuation.
Thank you. But if we want that to happen, there are some things that we can do that can help in a very concrete way. To get the job done, Australian manufacturers need access to affordable energy, be it for food manufacturing in Spence, making steel in Cunningham, or producing trucks in Oxley. Our energy price relief plan really important for Australian manufacturers, and that'll help them get goods to market better. It's also going to protect jobs. It will put downward pressure on prices, take up the fight on inflation. But as the global energy crisis started to take off and you saw skyrocketing coal and gas prices, what do we get out of those opposite? We had 22 failed energy plans, and they actively conspired to hide price hikes from the Australian public.
Order.
In the second quarter of 2022, the last quarter of those under those opposite, electricity prices paid by Australian manufacturers, they increased 60%. 60%. By contrast, new figures released last week show that the Albanese government's approach is working. AEMO, now they predicted electricity prices for manufacturers would go up by nearly 33% in the second quarter of this year. But last week they showed prices actually went down 1.5%. the big takeout on this is that the actions of the government help shield manufacturers from the worst of the price increases. Those actions: an energy price cap, price relief for households, a mandatory code of conduct that makes it easier for manufacturers and producers to strike up contracts.
The member for Fairfax is warned.
Now, those opposite, Speaker, they'll puff their chest and they'll say, I'll go to Canberra and I'll ask a question about energy price increases affecting manufacturers. But here's a radical idea, Speaker. Why don't those opposite ever look those manufacturers in the eye? Why don't they have the guts to say they voted against the very energy price relief that would have helped those manufacturers? Because this is the standout quality of those opposite.
The member for Fairfax.
They're never there with a solution, always there with a problem. Every single Liberal and National MP voted against energy price relief for manufacturers, just like every single Liberal and National MP refused to back Australian manufacturing by backing the National Reconstruction Fund. People have seen through these guys. They've seen that they only turn up for a camera, never there with a solution, always part of the problem.
The minister's time has concluded. Order. The member for Casey has the call.
My question is to the Prime Minister. James from Hillsville contacted me when he received a letter from his power company advising of his energy cost increases for the next year. James's peak electricity cost is up 44.4%, and off-peak electricity costs up 41.44%. James doesn't want a one-off handoff. He wants the prices to come down. Why is my constituent suffering because of this Prime Minister's incompetence?
Order. The member for Lawler. I give the call to the Prime Minister. Order. Members on my left. The member for Page is on a warning.
Yes, Mr. Speaker. I thank the member for Casey for his question. The government put in place measures that we brought before this parliament last year, of measures to assist individuals, measures to assist small business, measures to assist our economy. And what is clear is that those measures have made a substantial difference. What's also clear, and I hope the member for Casey,
the manager of opposition business.
I hope the member for Casey tells James that he voted against energy price relief for James. I hope he gets on the blower and says, "Sorry, James, I got it wrong.
Order.
I got it wrong. I voted against support for you." They voted against every other positive measure that's been brought before this parliament. Those opposite are obsessed with just saying no. They want people to be worse off because they think that will make them better off politically. That's the strategy that they have here, constantly being negative, constantly saying no. The Leader of the Opposition takes the last bit of his title very seriously. Opposition for opposition's sake, never putting forward a constructive idea. They had one proposal in their budget reply. It took them 11 weeks. To come up with costing, and then they folded their tent.
The Prime Minister will pause so I can hear from the manager of opposition business.
Well, Mr. Speaker, on relevance,
the Prime Minister,
James is going to be very impressed by your attitude.
The manager will resume his seat. Order. We'll move to the next question. I'll hear from the member for Bendigo.
My question is to the Minister for Climate Change and Energy. How is the Albanese Labor government taking action to ease pressure on small business energy costs? What obstacles did the government have to overcome to deliver this plan?
Give the call to the Minister for Climate Change and Energy.
Well, thanks very much, Mr. Speaker. I thank my honourable friend for her question and her
leadership of her businesses in Bendigo, which I've enjoyed visiting with her, as all ministers have on many occasions. She's an excellent Member of Parliament for regional Victoria. Now, here in the Albanese government, Mr Speaker, we know that energy costs are a huge issue for businesses, big and small, right across the country, and that's why we've acted. That's why we've acted. And in the face of rising energy costs around the world last year, and in the face of evidence that Australian industry, particularly in relation to gas prices, will come under huge pressure this year, and indeed many industries would be forced with a decision as to whether to stay open or close, we acted. And we've seen, as the Minister for Industry has updated us, the impact of that action in the last week. We've seen the ABS data showing that instead of an expected increase in the cost of energy for manufacturers of over 30%, those costs have gone down 1.5%, Mr Speaker. Instead of going up more than 30%, down 1.5%. We saw it also last week in the quarterly Energy Dynamics report, which showed that wholesale prices, Mr Speaker, are 60% lower today than they were a year ago. 60% lower today than they were a year ago. This is the direct impact of this government's intervention. Now, we know that industries and businesses went to see the opposition and begged them to support this intervention, asked them to act in a bipartisan way to protect Australian industry, and they got the hand. Go away, we're not interested, we're going to play politics. And yet they come in here day after day and pretend to care about energy prices. Instead of asking questions about high energy prices, they could vote for lower energy prices, and they made their choice. They made their decision. So we know that we need to act in the short term and in the medium and long term. We need to act for businesses small and large. And that's why, in addition to the intervention last year, which the opposition did not support, the budget contained further measures of support for Australian small businesses. The small business tax relief for up to 3.8 million small businesses
is warned
across
and will
Australia
now leave the
to
chamber under
invest
94A.
in renewable energy and energy efficiency to reduce their power prices. We know on this side what we're for. They know what they're against.
The Minister for Infrastructure will cease objecting.
They're against lower prices and they're against renewable energy, with their visceral hatred of renewable energy that so many members opposite have. On the other hand, Mr Speaker, the Albanese government will take whatever action is necessary to help small businesses, whether it be short-term interventions like last year's or longer-term interventions like the budget. Small business knows that they have a government on their side.
The member for Solomon can just resume his seat. The member for Flinders has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. A new report from the Consumer Action Law Centre has blamed the cost of living crisis for a spike in personal debt amongst Victorians, with average debt now at $2,459, up 43% in less than 2 years. Centre Director Luke Lovell said of the rise, "Thousands of Victorians will be turning off their heating and shivering through this winter as energy prices are set to soar." Why are Victorians suffering because of this Prime Minister's incompetence?
Order. The Treasurer will cease interjecting. Members on my right. The Prime Minister has the call.
Thank the member for Flinders for her question. I'm happy to get a question about cost of living because it provides me with an opportunity to talk about what we are doing with cost of living measures. We, of course, are trying to deal with inflation, and we have a three-point plan there. One, to turn what was a $78 billion deficit under those opposite into a surplus that will be around $20 billion, the first surplus in 15 years. That makes a difference. We're providing cost of living help that supports household budget without adding to inflation. So the measures that we have in place, not supported by the member for Flinders and those opposite, include cheaper childcare, making a difference, cheaper medicines that came into place on January 1, the energy bill relief, opposed by the member for Flinders and those opposite, affordable and social housing that the member opposite is opposing, that support for increased supply. On Monday morning, the member was part of a political party that was threatening to block rental relief for people on rent relief, the increases in job seeker payments, increases above that for over 55-year-olds,
Minister for Social Services.
the increased eligibility for paid parental payment for single parents, particularly for single mums. Those opposite were threatening to block that, and they said in one of their launches that they would do that. And no wonder it is the case that people look at those opposite and say, if they care about cost of living, why are they against every single cost of living measure? Cheaper medicines. Since January 1, I can inform the member that cheaper medicines have saved Australians $118 million as of last month. $118 million, that single measure. But the third measure we have as well is to invest in measures to tackle the supply chain side challenges. National Reconstruction Fund, Fee-Free TAFE, infrastructure investment, rewiring the nation, all making a difference. And we saw in the CPI in the June quarter that the CPI rose by 0.8%. And we know that the largest increase this century, Mr Speaker, was on the watch of those opposite. Back in the March 2022 quarter of 2.1%. And the member for Riverina shakes his head because he remembers those dark days.
Order. The Prime Minister's time has concluded. When the House comes to order, we'll hear from the member for Solomon.
Thanks so much, Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Communications. What is the Albanese Labor government doing to increase digital inclusion for First Nations Australians, particularly in rural and regional communities? And why is direct consultation with First Nations people so important in helping to narrow that digital divide?
The call to the Minister for Communications.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for Solomon for his question. Digital inclusion is central to the Albanese government's delivery of a more informed, connected and resilient nation. However, while digital inclusion is improving on average, there remains a considerable gap when it comes to First Nations inclusion, according to the latest Australian Digital Inclusion Index. Now, the gap is even more pronounced in remote and very remote First Nations communities. Closing the Gap Target 17 aims to achieve equal levels of digital inclusion between First Nations and non-First Nations Australians by 2026. But make no mistake, it is a significant challenge, particularly because previous attempts to close the gap have failed to respond to the needs of First Nations Australians. A recent landmark research project mapping the digital gap, undertaken through deep engagement with 12 remote First Nations communities, revealed the true nature of the gap, with shocking assessments of the realities on the ground and the failure of legacy approaches. Positive and measurable improvements require genuine consultation. And this is what I've heard directly from First Nations leaders and communities from Palm Island to Port Augusta to Darwin, where last week I launched our First Nations Digital Inclusion Plan, a framework that focuses government efforts around the three pillars of access, affordability and ability. Importantly, it commits us to serious, ongoing dialogue with First Nations communities about how to achieve Target 17. And consistent with that approach, the government established the First Nations Digital Inclusion Advisory Group earlier this year, experienced First Nations industry experts chaired by .West OAM. The group is highlighting barriers to access, including high costs for prepaid services and poor digital literacy, preventing First Nations communities from being able to enjoy the benefits of being online. Mr Speaker, past co-investment programs have not achieved the right outcomes because they generally assumed a one-size-fits-all approach. But when you ask First Nations communities what they need, whether it's connectivity or affordability or digital literacy barriers, you get more targeted and effective approaches and more cost-effective use of taxpayers' money. Digital inclusion is critical to economic and social opportunity, including access to health, education, financial and government services. And that's what The Voice can achieve across all portfolio areas. Positive engagement with First Nations communities from around the country getting the best outcomes. Mr Speaker, there is no sign that old approaches are succeeding, but at least in the communications portfolio, every sign that acting in response to genuine consultation, we can make all the difference.
Call to the Prime Minister.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. I ask that further questions be placed on the notice paper.